Most people don't realize the moment their life changes, until it's already too late to take it back. The rain came down in steady sheets, tapping against the glass windows of the nearly empty restaurant like a quiet warning no one was listening to, and inside, under dim amber lights, the last few customers lingered over half-finished plates while the staff moved slower than usual, counting minutes instead of tips, waiting for the night to end, and Sophie Bennett stood behind the counter, tying her apron a little tighter as if it could somehow hold her life together the same way she held herself together every single day, because tonight wasn't just another shift. Tonight was the difference between keeping her job or losing the only steady income she had left, and she knew it. Her manager had made that very clear just an hour ago with a tight smile and a quiet warning that sounded polite but felt like a countdown. One more mistake, Sophie, he had said, and we're done, and she had nodded, swallowing the exhaustion sitting heavy in her chest, because being late didn't sound like a big deal to anyone else. But when you spent the night before in a hospital room holding your mother's hand while machines beeped softly in the dark, time didn't move the same way anymore. It slipped, it blurred, it disappeared, and now here she was, trying to catch up with a world that didn't slow down for anyone, not even for kindness, not even for grief, and she took a breath, forcing a small smile as she picked up a tray, repeating quietly under her breath the one thing she had always believed even when everything else fell apart: people don't remember what they eat, they remember how you treat them. And for a second, she almost believed it would be enough, until the door opened with a sharp chime that cut through the room and every head turned just slightly, not out of curiosity but instinct, because something about the man who walked in didn't match the place at all. His clothes were damp, his jacket thin and worn, water dripping quietly onto the polished floor as he stepped inside like he wasn't sure he belonged there, and maybe he didn't, maybe that was exactly the point. Because Alexander Hayes paused just long enough to take in the room, the glances, the subtle judgment that flickered across faces before disappearing just as quickly, and he had seen that look before, more times than he could count. But tonight he wasn't the man they thought he was. Tonight he wasn't the billionaire whose name sat on the top floors of glass towers downtown. Tonight he was just another stranger walking in from the rain. Just another man who looked like he couldn't afford to be here, and that was exactly how he wanted it, because somewhere between boardroom betrayals and a broken engagement that had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about people, Alexander had decided there was only one way to find out the truth about someone. You take everything away, the money, the status, the power, and you see how they treat you when you have nothing left to offer. And as he moved toward a small table near the window, ignoring the hesitation of a server who clearly didn't want to take him, his eyes lifted just once and landed on Sophie, who was already walking toward him before anyone else could stop her, her steps steady, her expression calm, like she hadn't noticed the way he didn't fit, or maybe like she simply didn't care. And when she reached the table, she set down a glass of water without being asked, her voice gentle but clear. "Hey, welcome in, what can I get started for you tonight?" And for the first time that evening, something shifted. Just slightly, just enough to make Alexander look at her a little longer than he meant to, because kindness, real kindness, wasn't loud, it didn't try to prove anything, it just showed up quietly, exactly when you needed it most, and he wondered, just for a second, if she even knew the test had already begun. Alexander did not answer right away, not because he did not know what to say, but because he was watching, measuring, quietly taking in every small detail the way he always did when something mattered more than it should. And Sophie stood there patiently, not rushing him, not forcing a smile, just present in a way that felt almost unfamiliar to him. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost hesitant. "What is the cheapest thing on the menu?" And for a brief second, something flickered across her face, not judgment, not annoyance, just a quick calculation, like she was trying to understand the question behind the question. And then she gave a small nod. "We have a grilled cheese and a cup of tomato soup. It is about $6, and he glanced at the menu anyway, even though he had already decided before walking in that he would choose whatever cost the least, because the point was never the food, the point was always the reaction. And he closed the menu slowly, placing it back down with a quiet tap. "I will take that," he said, and added after a pause, "and just water is fine." And there it was, the first layer of the test, simple, ordinary, something that should not have meant anything, yet it always did, because he had seen how quickly people changed when they believed someone had nothing to offer, how kindness became optional, how respect became conditional. And Sophie simply nodded again, writing it down without hesitation. "You got it," she said, her tone steady, like this order carried the same weight as any other, like he was no different from the well-dressed couple at the corner table or the businessman scrolling through his phone near the bar, and that alone was enough to make something tighten slightly in Alexander's chest, something he did not want to name, not yet, and as she walked away, he noticed the other server, a tall man with a tired expression, lean in toward her, whispering something under his breath that made him glance back at Alexander with a faint smirk, and even without hearing the words, Alexander knew exactly what had been said. He had heard variations of it his entire life, just dressed in different tones, different levels of politeness, but always the same message underneath: not worth the effort, not worth the time. And Sophie just shook her head slightly, not engaging, not feeding into it, and continued toward the kitchen like the comment had not landed at all. And that was when Alexander leaned back in his chair, folding his hands loosely in front of him, because now the test could begin for real, not the easy version, not the surface-level politeness that anyone could perform for a few seconds, but the kind that required something more, something real. And when Sophie returned a few minutes later with his water, he reached out just a second too late, letting his fingers brush the glass in a way that tipped it slightly, enough for it to spill across the table and drip down toward the floor. Not dramatic, not obvious, just inconvenient. The kind of small mess that often revealed more than any question ever could. And he looked up immediately, already prepared for the shift, the sigh, the irritation that usually followed. But instead, Sophie moved quickly, grabbing a towel from her apron, her voice soft. "It is okay, I have got it," and she wiped the table with careful movements, not rushed, not exaggerated, just focused. And when she finished, she placed the glass back in front of him, this time a little farther from the edge, and gave him a small reassuring smile. "Happens all the time," she added, like she was trying to take the embarrassment away before it could settle in. And Alexander held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, because that was not part of the script he had come to expect, not even close. And something about the way she said it, like she genuinely meant it, like she was protecting his dignity instead of her time, made the room feel just a little quieter than before. And for the first time since he walked in, Alexander was not entirely sure how the rest of this was supposed to go. The kitchen bell rang softly in the background as Sophie returned a few minutes later, balancing a small tray with practiced ease, the faint steam from the soup curling into the air as she set it down carefully in front of him, placing the grilled cheese beside it like it deserved the same attention as any expensive entree in the building. And for a moment, Alexander just looked at it, not because of what it was, but because of how it was given. Without hesitation, without the subtle dismissal he had come to expect. And Sophie straightened slightly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear as she offered a quiet, careful, "The plate is hot," and he nodded, watching her hands, the small movements, the way she treated something simple like it mattered. And it was strange how something so ordinary could feel so unfamiliar. And as she turned to leave, he spoke again, adding another layer to the test, his tone almost uncertain. "Can I get extra napkins?" And she glanced back with a small smile, already reaching into her apron. "Of course," she said, handing him more than he asked for, not counting, not rationing, just giving. And then she moved away again, leaving him alone with the quiet hum of the room and the weight of something he had not expected to feel this early. And Alexander picked up the sandwich, taking a slow bite, barely tasting it, his focus somewhere else entirely, because this was not about the food. It had never been about the food. It was about the pattern, the predictable shift that usually came next, the moment when patience wore thin, when kindness became conditional. And so he let a few minutes pass before setting the sandwich down again, pushing the plate slightly away as Sophie returned to check on him, her expression open, attentive. "Everything okay?" she asked, and he hesitated just enough to make it believable, glancing down at the table. "Actually, I am sorry, I think I ordered the wrong thing," he said, his voice careful, like he did not want to cause trouble but was doing it anyway. And there it was, the second layer, the inconvenience. The kind that cost time, effort, money, the kind that usually revealed the truth faster than anything else. And Sophie paused for a fraction of a second, not annoyed, not frustrated, just processing. And then she nodded. "No problem, what would you like instead?" And he looked up at her, searching, testing. "What do you recommend?" he asked, knowing full well that anything she suggested would be more expensive, knowing that this was where most people began to draw the line. And she considered it for a moment before pointing gently toward the menu. "The chicken pasta is really good, it is about $12, but if you are not that hungry, I can keep this and bring you something lighter." and he leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch. Just enough before delivering the final push, the part that almost always broke the illusion. "I do not think I can afford that," he said quietly, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just honest enough to feel real, and for the first time, Sophie did not respond immediately, her eyes softening just slightly as she looked at him, not with pity, not with judgment, but with something else, something steadier, and then she gave a small nod, sliding the plate back toward him gently. "Then this is perfect," she said, her voice warm, certain, like there was nothing lacking about the choice at all, and she added after a second, almost like she was sharing a secret, "It is actually one of my favorites," and something about the way she said it, like she was protecting his dignity again, like she was making sure he did not feel small in a place that made people feel small all the time, made Alexander's chest tighten in a way he did not expect. Because this was not part of the plan, not part of the script he had rehearsed in his head, and yet here it was, unfolding anyway, piece by piece, breaking through the walls he had built without asking for permission. And as Sophie walked away once more, leaving him with the simplest meal on the menu, Alexander realized something quietly unsettling. The test was no longer just about her, it was beginning to feel like it was about him too. The rain outside had not slowed, if anything it had grown steadier, heavier, the kind that blurred the world beyond the glass into something distant and unreachable, and inside the restaurant the air felt warmer, quieter, like time had decided to move a little slower for those still inside, and Sophie continued moving between tables with the same calm rhythm, refilling drinks, clearing plates, offering small smiles that felt real even when she was clearly running on exhaustion, and Alexander watched her more than he realized, not in an obvious way, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that every small detail began to stand out, the way she paused for a second longer with an elderly couple, the way she crouched slightly to speak to a child at eye level, the way she never once made anyone feel rushed even though the clock on the wall said closing time was getting closer, and it did not make sense to him, not entirely, because people usually adjusted their effort based on what they received in return. That was how the world worked, that was how he had built everything he had, and yet she moved through the room like the return did not matter at all, like the act itself was enough, and that unsettled him more than anything else so far, because it challenged something deeper than the test, something he had stopped believing in a long time ago, and as the minutes passed, he knew there was only one layer left to push, the final edge where kindness either held or collapsed, and when Sophie returned again, checking quietly if he needed anything else, he reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, letting the moment stretch just enough before pulling his hand back out empty, his expression shifting in a way that was careful but convincing. "I think I left my wallet somewhere," he said, his voice low, almost embarrassed, and there it was, the line that almost always changed everything, the moment when patience ended, when rules took over, when kindness turned into obligation or refusal, and Sophie froze for the smallest fraction of a second, not in anger, not in suspicion, but in thought, her eyes searching his face briefly like she was trying to understand something beyond the words, and then she exhaled softly, nodding once. "Okay," she said, not loudly, not dramatically, just accepting the situation as it was, and he waited, watching, expecting the follow-up, the policy explanation, the call for a manager, the shift he had seen so many times before, but it did not come. Instead she glanced toward the register, then back at him, lowering her voice just slightly. "It happens," she added, like she was letting him off the hook for something he had not even asked forgiveness for, and before he could respond, she reached into her apron, pulling out a few folded bills, counting them quickly with fingers that moved from habit, and placing them discreetly on the edge of the table, close enough that he would see, far enough that no one else would. "I will cover it tonight," she said, her tone steady, like this was not a sacrifice, not a burden, just a decision, and for a second, Alexander did not move, did not speak, because something about that moment felt heavier than anything else that had happened so far, heavier than the test, heavier than the plan, because this was not politeness anymore, this was not surface-level kindness that cost nothing, this was something else entirely, something that required her to give up something she clearly did not have much of, and he looked at the bills, then back at her, searching for hesitation, for regret, for any sign that this was forced or calculated, but there was nothing there except quiet certainty, and she added gently, almost as if she was protecting him again, "You can come back and pay me whenever you want, or not, it is okay." And that was the moment everything shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that was impossible to ignore, because Alexander had spent years building a world Where everything had a price, where loyalty could be bought, where affection came with conditions, and standing here now, watching someone give without expecting anything in return, without even asking his name, he realized something he had not expected to realize at all. This was not a test anymore, and he was no longer in control of what came next. For a moment, the sound of the rain seemed to fade completely, like the world outside had stepped back to give space to something quieter, something more fragile unfolding at that small table by the window, and Alexander stared at the bills she had placed there, not large, not insignificant, just enough to matter to someone who counted every dollar, and he could tell she did, not because she said it, but because of the way her fingers had paused for half a second before letting go, the way she had folded them neatly as if that small gesture gave the money more purpose than just covering a meal, and he looked back up at her, his voice lower now, less certain than before. "You do not even know me," he said, and Sophie gave a small shrug, almost like the answer was simpler than the question itself. "I know enough," she replied, and there was no performance in her tone, no attempt to impress or prove anything, just a quiet belief that seemed to exist without needing validation, and that unsettled him more than anything else so far, because he had built his entire life on knowing exactly how people worked, on predicting their choices, their limits, their breaking points, and she was not following any of it, not even close, and for the first time in a long time, Alexander did not know what the next move was supposed to be, and that feeling, unfamiliar and strangely uncomfortable, made him lean back slightly, studying her with a different kind of attention now, not as someone being tested, but as someone he was trying to understand, and Sophie glanced toward the front of the restaurant where her manager stood near the register, his eyes scanning the room with quiet impatience, and she lowered her voice just a little more. "It is getting late, we close in about 15 minutes. She said, not as a hint, not as pressure. Just information, and then she added, almost as an afterthought, "If you want, I can pack the rest of this to go." And Alexander looked down at the plate again, then back at her, something shifting behind his expression that he did not try to hide this time. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, and the question lingered for a second, not heavy, not confrontational, just honest in a way he had not allowed himself to be in a long time, and Sophie paused, her eyes meeting his fully now, and for the first time since they had started talking, there was a hint of something deeper there, something personal, and she smiled softly, not wide, not forced, just enough to carry the weight of what she was about to say. "Because someone once did it for me," she answered, and that was it, no long explanation, no dramatic story, just a simple truth that somehow said more than anything else could have, and Alexander felt something shift again, deeper this time, something that reached past the surface of the test and into a place he had been avoiding for a long time, because kindness that came from experience was different. It was not random, it was chosen, repeated, carried forward, and he nodded slowly, not because he fully understood it yet, but because he recognized it, and that recognition was enough to quiet something inside him that had been restless for years, and Sophie stepped back slightly, giving him space again, like she always did, never pushing, never demanding, just present when needed and gone when not, and as she turned to leave, the manager's voice cut through the room, sharper now, calling her name with a tone that carried warning more than urgency, and she paused mid-step, glancing back at Alexander for just a second, offering one last small smile. "It is okay," she said again, softer this time, almost like she was reassuring him one more time before whatever came next, and then she walked toward the front, toward the consequences she already knew were waiting, and Alexander sat there, the untouched bills still on the table, the simplest meal growing cold in front of him. And for the first time since he had walked into that restaurant, he was no longer thinking about the test. He was thinking about her, about what it meant to give when you had so little, about what it said about a person who chose kindness not because it was easy, but because it was right, and somewhere between the rain tapping against the window and the quiet tension building near the register, Alexander Hayes realized something he had not expected to realize at all. He had not just found what he was looking for, he had found something he did not know he needed, and he was not about to let it walk away. The tension near the register thickened in a way that did not need raised voices to be felt, the kind that settled into the air and made everything else in the room seem quieter by comparison, and Alexander watched as Sophie approached her manager, her shoulders squared but not defensive, her steps steady even though she already knew how this would end, and the manager leaned forward slightly, his expression tight, his words low but sharp enough to carry across the short distance. "Did you cover a customer's bill with your own money again?" he asked, not really asking, and Sophie hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding, not denying it, not explaining it away, just owning the choice the same way she had made it, and that alone seemed to irritate him more than anything else, because it did not fit the rules he believed in, the rules of profit, efficiency, control, and he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "We have policies for a reason, Sophie, you cannot just decide who pays and who does not," he said, and she kept her voice calm, respectful. "He said he forgot his wallet. I just did not want to embarrass him," and that word, embarrass, hung there for a second, like it meant more than the situation itself, like it revealed something deeper about her priorities, and the manager's expression hardened, not cruel, just firm in the way people become when they stop seeing individuals and start seeing numbers. "This is not a charity," he replied, straightening slightly, "and I cannot keep someone on staff who makes decisions like that." And there it was. The moment that had been building since the beginning of the night, not loud, not dramatic, just final, and Sophie lowered her gaze for a brief second, not in shame, not in regret, just in acceptance, like she had already prepared herself for this outcome long before it happened, and she nodded once, quietly. "I understand," she said, and there was no argument, no plea, no attempt to change his mind, just a calm acknowledgement that somehow made the moment feel heavier instead of lighter, and Alexander felt something tighten in his chest again, sharper this time, because this was not part of the test anymore. This was consequence, real and immediate, and it was happening because of him, because of the situation he had created. And as Sophie untied her apron slowly, folding it with the same care she seemed to give everything else, he realized something that unsettled him even more than before. She was not angry, she was not even disappointed, she was simply accepting the cost of being who she chose to be, and that was something he had never truly understood until now. And when she placed the apron on the counter and turned to leave, her eyes scanning the room one last time, they stopped on him for just a second, and she gave that same small, reassuring smile again, like she was still trying to make sure he was okay even now, even after everything. And then she walked toward the door, toward the rain, toward whatever came next, and something inside Alexander shifted completely in that moment, because this was no longer about proving a point or confirming a belief. This was about a person who had just lost something real because she chose kindness over convenience, and he pushed his chair back abruptly, the sound cutting through the quiet room, drawing a few glances as he stood, his gaze fixed on the door she had just walked through, and for the first time that night, there was no hesitation in him at all, because whatever this was, whatever she had shown him in the span of a single meal, it was not something he was willing to let disappear into the rain. And as he reached for his jacket, the forgotten role he had been playing slipping away with every step, Alexander Hayes understood one thing with absolute clarity: some tests are not meant to be observed from a distance, some moments demand a response, and this was one of them. The door had barely stopped swinging when the cold night air rushed in again, carrying the steady rhythm of rain and the quiet echo of footsteps fading into the distance, and Alexander stepped outside without hesitation, the shift from warm light to damp darkness sharp but almost unnoticeable compared to the urgency building inside him, because for the first time in a long time, he was not calculating outcomes or weighing risks, he was simply reacting. And across the dimly lit sidewalk, he spotted her just a few yards away, standing under the weak glow of a flickering streetlight, pulling her thin jacket tighter around herself as if it could block out more than just the cold. And for a second, he paused, not because he was unsure of what to do, but because something about the moment felt fragile, like saying the wrong thing could break it completely. And then he walked toward her, steady, deliberate, his shoes splashing lightly against the rain-soaked pavement until she turned at the sound, her expression shifting slightly when she recognized him, not surprised, not alarmed, just quietly curious. "Hey," she said softly, as if this was just another normal interaction in a night that had already changed too much, and Alexander stopped a few steps away, the distance between them filled with everything that had just happened, everything that still had not been said, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the rain filling the silence with a steady, almost grounding rhythm. And then he reached into his jacket, this time not empty, this time not part of a test, pulling out a sleek leather wallet that had been there all along, and he held it for just a second before looking back at her, his voice lower now, stripped of the careful control it had carried before. "I did not forget it," he said, and the words hung there, simple but heavy with meaning, and Sophie blinked once, processing, her eyes moving briefly to the wallet, then back to his face, and there was no anger there, no immediate reaction, just a quiet understanding beginning to form. You were testing me, she said, not accusing, not hurt, just stating what now felt obvious, and Alexander nodded slowly, not trying to defend it, not trying to soften it. Yes, he admitted, and the honesty in his voice made the word land differently, less like a trick and more like a confession, and Sophie let out a small breath, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, not because it did not matter, but because she had already made her choice hours ago without knowing any of this, and nothing about that had changed, and she looked at him for a long moment, the rain catching in her hair, the streetlight casting a soft glow that made everything feel a little more real, a little more grounded, and then she gave a small nod, almost to herself. Okay, she said, and that was it, no dramatic reaction, no anger, just acceptance, and that simplicity caught Alexander off guard more than anything else, because he had expected something stronger, something sharper, something that would match the weight of what he had done, and instead, she just stood there, steady as always, and he took a step closer, his voice quieter now, more certain. You did not have to do any of that, he said, referring to the meal, the money, the choice that had cost her more than he had intended, and Sophie gave a faint smile, the same one she had given him inside, the one that carried more meaning than most words. I know, she replied, and then she added, after a brief pause, but I wanted to. And that was the moment it became clear, completely, undeniably clear, that everything he thought he understood about people had just shifted, not because of a grand gesture, not because of something extraordinary, but because of a simple choice made by someone who had nothing to gain and everything to lose, and Alexander felt it settle in, not as a realization that passed, but as something that stayed, something that would not let him go back to the way things were before, and as the rain continued to fall around them, steady and unchanging, he understood that this moment was not the end of the test, it was the beginning of something he had not planned for at all. The rain continued to fall between them, steady and unhurried, like the world had no intention of interrupting whatever this moment was becoming, and for a few seconds, neither of them moved, not because they did not have somewhere to go, but because something about standing there felt more important than anything waiting beyond it, and Alexander glanced briefly back toward the restaurant, the soft glow of its lights now distant behind the glass, and then back at Sophie, his expression shifting again, not into the composed certainty he was known for, but into something more open, more deliberate, like he had made a decision he was not going to second guess. You should not have lost your job for that, he said quietly, and Sophie gave a small shrug, the kind that carried acceptance rather than regret. It was not just that, she replied, her voice calm. I have been late a few times, and I knew it was coming. And she paused for a second before adding, almost as if she was trying to make it easier for him, this just made it happen sooner, and Alexander watched her closely, the way she framed it, the way she refused to place blame anywhere except where it belonged, and that only made the weight of it feel heavier, not lighter, because she was not asking for anything, not even understanding, and he stepped a little closer, the rain catching along the edges of his jacket. It still should not have happened like that, he said, and this time there was something firmer in his tone, something that came from a place he did not usually reveal, and Sophie tilted her head slightly, studying him with that same quiet curiosity she had carried all night. Things do not always happen the way they should, she said softly, and there was no bitterness in it. Just truth, and that truth landed differently than anything else she had said so far, because it was not idealistic, it was not naive, it was grounded, earned, and still, she had chosen kindness anyway. And Alexander let out a slow breath, his hand tightening slightly around the wallet he still held, and for a second, he looked down at it, then back at her, like he was deciding how much of the truth to give, and then he spoke. Not with hesitation, but with intention. My name is Alexander Hayes, he said, and Sophie's eyes shifted just slightly, not widening in shock, not reacting the way most people did when they heard that name, but simply recognizing it, placing it, understanding it, and that alone told him everything he needed to know about her again, because she did not step back, she did not change her posture, she did not suddenly treat him differently, she just nodded once. Okay, she said, and the simplicity of that response made something almost unexpected rise in his chest. Something close to relief, because for once, the name did not change the moment, it did not redefine the connection that had already been built, and he took another step closer, closing the distance just enough that his voice did not have to compete with the rain. I own the company that owns this place, he continued, not as a statement of power, but as context, and Sophie absorbed that quietly, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, and after a second, she gave a small, almost amused exhale, "That explains a lot," she said, and there was no edge to it, no sarcasm, just a simple acknowledgement that things now made more sense, and Alexander found himself almost smiling at that, just slightly, before the seriousness returned. "Come back with me tomorrow morning," he said, and this time it was not a request wrapped in politeness, it was something more grounded, more certain. 9 o'clock, same place, and Sophie hesitated for the first time since he had met her, not because she was unsure of him, but because she was weighing something internally, and then she asked, her voice steady, "Why?" And the question hung there, simple, direct, exactly what it needed to be, and Alexander held her gaze, not looking away this time, not softening the truth, "Because you gave when you had no reason to," he said, his voice quieter but unwavering, "and I do not intend to let that be the end of your story." And the rain continued to fall around them, but something about the space between them had changed completely, like the next step had already been set in motion, waiting only for her to decide if she would take it. The next morning arrived quieter than the night before, the storm gone, leaving behind streets washed clean and a sky that felt almost unfamiliar in its calm, and Sophie stood across the street from the restaurant, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her jacket, watching as the doors opened and employees filtered in, their routines unchanged, their world continuing as if nothing had happened, and for a moment, she wondered if she should turn around. If it would be easier to let the night remain exactly what it was, a strange, unexpected moment that came and went without consequence, but then she remembered the way he had looked at her, not with power, not with expectation, but with something steadier, something that felt real, and that was enough to keep her feet where they were. And at exactly 9 o'clock, a black car pulled up to the curb, smooth and deliberate, drawing just enough attention to shift the atmosphere without overwhelming it, and Alexander stepped out, no longer the man from the night before, no longer blending into the background, but not distant either, not untouchable, just present in a way that carried both authority and intention, and when his eyes found hers, there was no hesitation, no second-guessing, just recognition, and he walked toward her, closing the space between them like it was always meant to be crossed. "You came," he said simply, and Sophie gave a small nod, her expression calm. "You asked me to," she replied, and something about that answer made the corner of his mouth lift slightly before he gestured toward the entrance. "Come inside," he said, and this time, when they stepped through the doors, everything felt different, not because the place had changed, but because the roles had. And the manager who had dismissed her just hours before now stood frozen near the counter, his posture shifting quickly as recognition set in, his expression tightening with a mix of confusion and realization, and Alexander did not raise his voice, did not create a scene, he simply walked forward with the same quiet control he carried into every room that mattered. "We need to talk," he said, and within minutes, the space had transformed. The dynamic flipped without force, without drama, just the undeniable weight of truth settling into place, and Sophie stood slightly behind him, not hidden, not pushed forward, just present, watching as something she had never asked for began to unfold, and Alexander turned back to her after a brief exchange that required very few words, his focus returning fully, like everything else was secondary now, and he reached into his pocket, pulling out something small, something familiar, placing it gently in her hand, and when she looked down, she saw the folded receipt from the night before, the edges slightly worn, the total circled in ink, and beside it, the exact amount she had paid, neatly placed, untouched, and he spoke again, his voice steady, but softer than it had been in any boardroom or meeting he had ever walked into. "You said people remember how they are treated," he began, his eyes holding hers, "and last night, you treated someone with nothing like they mattered." And Sophie felt something shift again, quieter this time, deeper, and he continued, "I do not want that to be something that costs you everything," and he paused, not for effect, but because the next part mattered. "I want you to help me build something where that is the standard, not the exception," and she blinked once, processing, not the offer itself, but what it represented, the weight of it, the trust behind it, and she looked at him, searching for anything that felt uncertain, anything that suggested this was temporary or conditional, but there was nothing there except intention, and slowly, she closed her hand around the receipt and the money, holding on to the smallest reminder of the moment that had changed everything, and she gave a small nod, not rushed, not overwhelmed, just certain. "Okay," she said, and in that single word, something settled between them, not just an agreement, not just an opportunity, but the beginning of something built on something far stronger than circumstance, and as the morning light filtered through the windows, soft and steady, it became clear that what started as a test had turned into something neither of them had planned, something real, something lasting, because in a world that measured everything in numbers and outcomes, one simple act of kindness had rewritten the story entirely.